I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. This episode of the podcast is going to end up discussing being outed as a gay person, and also there is a suicide mention as well. If for any reason you feel like you would be negatively impacted by those topics and you don't want to hear about them right now, then please feel free to skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. I am testing out a kind of new setup. I have put my phone in a different space so that I'm able to record the audio easier. I really hope this experiment works and that it doesn't come out terribly. I'm also hoping I don't randomly breathe really loudly into the microphone, because that does happen on occasion. But we'll see in the editing process how this goes. Hopefully nothing ends up ruined. But anyway, welcome to April. Well, it'll be the end of April when you hear this episode, but it is April. We are barreling through this year. March felt very, very long. Did anyone else's March feel very long? I think it's because I've had a very, very busy time at work. It's just felt very long. And it hasn't really been helped by the fact that I have chosen to do this project where I watch deliberately terrible queer movies and talk about them, because I end up watching a lot of stuff that I just don't want to end up returning to, and I have to in order to make notes for this podcast. But yeah, my challenge for the year has been to try and find any kind of meaning in some of the worst rated LGBT movies. And the great contender for this episode is GBF.
Explain this to me again. How will being the first out kid in school make you instantly popular?
It's simple. All the teen and tween rags agree. The hottest new trend sweeping schools worldwide is the GBF.
GBF?
Gay best friend. Every celeb has one, so every teen girl needs one. And pretty soon, all 3 prom queen frontrunners will be battling it out for my attention.
GBF is a 2013 teen dramedy written by George Northey and directed by Darren Stein that attempts to satirize the idea of the gay best friend and situate it in a high school where identity is everything and gay teenagers should come out, not to signal to the world that it's okay to be gay, but to become the newest fashion accessory to whichever popular girl digs her claws in the hardest. After Tanner is outed via a gay hookup app, he is thrust into the high school spotlight and adopted into the various popular cliques, exploring the benefits and massive drawbacks to being out and commodified by a very heteronormative school setting. In no way would I describe this film as timeless. It very specifically evokes an era of MTV esoterica that relied on provocation over substance. See shows like Faking It and Awkward. But at the same time, its pacing and tone problems didn't necessarily hinder my general enjoyment of what I believe is a mostly well-intentioned piece of fluff from the It Gets Better period of gay history. It is always surprising when I come across something that is as maligned as some of the films that I'm going to be exploring this year, to find that they did actually win awards and were somewhat well received, at least by certain groups. But yeah, this film won Best Soundtrack, Best Screenplay and Best Comedy at Film Out Festival. I tend to find when I do these kind of retrospectives is that the worst considered films are usually the ones that either they cause a lot of controversy, like a massive amount of backlash, or they're teeny tiny and nobody sees them except the odd few people who stumble across them on like Netflix one day. Because I'm pretty sure that's how I watched this film for the first time. There does seem to be a very intense focus on what are ostensibly teeny tiny films that haven't really had the massive impact on culture that they may be intended to have. Regardless, on Rotten Tomatoes, this has a 80% critic score, which is kind of amazing, but an audience score of 55%, and it does have a Letterboxd score of 2.4. So what I kind of gather from these reviews is that at the time, it was kind of seen as harmless, if not kind of obvious weirdly paced and constructed, but not outright bigoted, and for that reason a lot of people were very gentle with it. Whereas I think Letterboxd is a newer site, and the rediscovery of LGBT films through Letterboxd lists kind of causes younger people to come across something that if you weren't there for it, you might not really understand. Here are some of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd. So this first one is by Neve, who says, GBF stands for genuinely bad film. You do tend to find that the most popular reviews on Letterboxd are going to be quippy and glib like that. It's a decent enough gauge for the cultural consensus of what a film has done, and I do think that this kind of like dismissal of this film, it gels well with Letterboxd culture, in my opinion. And I say this as someone who genuinely loves the site and loves using it and uses it every day. Sometimes I want more analysis, which is why I did this podcast. This next review comes from Willa, who says, watching this as a closeted teen builds character, gays these days will never experience that. Yeah, I do think to a certain extent it does bring up this quite harsh cultural divide where I think to a certain extent a lot of the younger gay teenagers are going to end up kind of taking for granted the level of representation that goes on now. And it's still not great. Like, we're not experiencing a glut of it at the moment. Case in point, I've really struggled to find LGBT films to talk about for the bonus episodes of this podcast. But I do think, like, just generally, when you search for modern gay teen movies, I was able to find at least a few to watch in comparison to this film, whereas at the time there weren't that many really. And I think it's interesting to think of this as like a touchstone of a particular period of time that is not great. I was a teenager around this time, so it wasn't a fun time to be like a queer teenager. It wasn't a fun time to try and find any like LGBT representation either. It was getting better, and you could feel it getting better. You could feel like progressive voices coming up and being like, we want more of this on screen. But for what it is, I think it is kind of successful in at least contesting the viewpoint of gayness as a commodity rather than like an individual identity that's usually quite personal. Whether or not it comes across as old man yelling at cloud, we will explore later in the episode. This last review is from Alice, who says, when Fawcett said, he obvs died of the HIV, that's cinema, baby. Here's what I'll say. A Darren Stein film is trying very, very hard to be iconic, and on occasion there will be a line that will genuinely take you off guard and make you laugh really hard. And I am going to get into why his work doesn't always quite get to the like iconic status that it's aiming for. I do also think that he has like a genuine love and admiration for shitty women. And there is something here, even if it feels like messy and uneven and kind of not funny for most of it. The attempts at being like a quirky film with quirky dialogue, it's trying very hard. And like I said, about 30% of the time it hits. And this line, he obvs died of the HIV, it does get you, it does catch you off guard, and that is not nothing. A spoiler warning. Do I recommend you go seek this film out? If you've never seen it before, then yeah, I would at least, just to, I guess, witness 2013 gay culture, 2013 teen culture, 2013 MTV culture. I think as like a time capsule, it's genuinely interesting. If you've seen it before and you haven't watched it since it first came out, I looked back on it kind of favourably. I don't think it has a lot of sticking power with anybody else. I haven't really seen that many people be like, it's secretly good. I've seen people be like, it's secretly well-intentioned and sometimes funny. A spoiler for my opinion on this film is that it's mostly fine and that I've seen worse. But it doesn't really have the staying power that I think it was going for. Regardless, I am going to spoil the film from here on out. So if you were in any way compelled by my description of it or these reviews, and you wanted to watch it, go do that now and then come back.
You're the secret gay. But you're not even that fabulous.
I guess I am. Not fabulous, but gay. I'm gay, I guess.
Oh, we've got one. Our very own homosexual.
More and more during the research process of making these episodes, I've been enjoying like watching other films that are like adjacent or tangentially related to the film. So with Lesbian Vampire Killers, the previous episode that I did, I watched some British horror from the late 2000s that I felt had a misogynistic slant to it. Not a fun time, but with this episode, I had a bit more fun in that I watched / rewatched teen comedies, teen dramedies, teen films about gay teenagers that are like set in high school. Now granted, that last category is a lot smaller than the other two, but I think it's kind of essential to, one, understanding this film, but two, also kind of detrimental because you are automatically comparing it to these other films that by comparison are just kind of more interesting, more entertaining. Not all of them are like that. Some of them are bad and have always been bad. But what you get is a good kind of gauge on what the tropes are and how they are used within the various parts of the film and what they kind of signify. A name that turned up a lot, and it even turned up from the mouth of Darren Stein himself, was John Hughes, which is the most obvious example when discussing the teen comedy, because he very much popularized and solidified at least some of the tropes of the teen comedy, how they follow a period of maturity in someone who is very much trying to figure out who they are and what they want to do, and they bring like levity to dark moments but also take the teenage experience very seriously. Lydia Smith said in the article The Evolution of the Teen Movie that John Hughes turned mundane suburban angst into something palpable and entertaining. He had honourable messages: be true to yourself, reject oppressive authority, don't judge a book by its cover, live in the moment. And by teen movie standards, he spawned a revolution. In an interview with Once Upon a Bookcase, Darren Stein had this to say: it's refreshing that a story from a gay perspective doesn't need to be melancholy or painful. John Hughes and Amy Heckerling teen films are celebrations. Why not find joy in a story with a gay lead? And I think it is very much something that we take for granted, that in a lot of ways, these movies just didn't exist for gay teenagers. And when I say that, I do mean a teen comedy, because I do think there have been quite a few teen dramas, movies about being gay and being in the closet and living in anguish because of that experience. But in terms of like teen comedies, they are a very, very new genre for the gay teenager. The closest that I could find, I think, was Edge of 17, which for all intents and purposes is more of a drama than a comedy. Like, I went into it with the assumption that it was a romantic comedy. I think the poster kind of makes it seem a lot more light and fluffy than it actually ends up being, in that it's less about a gay teenager finding love and more about a gay teenager realizing that just because you are gay and attracted to someone of the same gender, that does not mean the person you're attracted to is necessarily going to be worthy of that attraction, that this this crush, this new experience with sex is going to be good and clean and, and normal, and that the expectations your parents have of you are not the only ones that should matter, and that trying to be the person that they want you to be is probably not going to end up well. You see how like the theme of queerness adds this kind of heaviness to a plot that I think a lot of screenwriters know how to turn into something funny. And I think for a long period of time where gay rights haven't seemed so solidified in culture, trying to make, I guess, comedy out of being that kind of teenager, it requires queerness to be accepted, which is why films like Booksmart or Do Revenge or Crush is another film, why those films can behave as though queerness is naturalized and something that isn't, it doesn't have to be the main struggle of the character. Other things can be also the conflict. It doesn't have to be that someone is wrestling with their gay identity. It can be outside forces or just like random conflict. I think a lot of gay teenagers have got on their knees and prayed for just a light comedy like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where gay teenagers can like fuck around and make nonsense and not have it be this horrible, heavy, traumatic experience, even if that is true to life and culture, because levity is like important and seeing yourself on screen is important. Firstly, I think people underestimate how hard it has been to even get to a place where gayness can be seen as something joyful but also like humorous. And it's not to say that there haven't been gay comedies at all, but very few of them have centered on adolescence, and when they have, they've usually been heavy. They've been about conversion therapy, they've been about suicide, they've been about just very like heavy traumatic topics that, whilst are true to life, they can't really be turned into like jokes in the same way like A Breakfast Club or A Clueless can, you know? Regardless, I think the attempt to take these kinds of films and use their tropes against genre to, I guess, talk about how either gay identity has been obscured or removed from these narratives, or how trying to jam gay identity into straight culture often results in the commodification of it. We have these three popular girls, and they're all in different cliques. They're all trying to be the queen of the school. So you have Fawcett, who is the blonde, bitchy, popular girl. You have Schlee, whose name really is that, who is the intensely Mormon girl. And you have Caprice, who is the head of the drama kids, and they're all kind of vying for the attention of a gay student to increase their social clout and to provide them with the superiority over their classmates, but particularly over each other. They're described as neighbouring warlords by Tanner, who is the narrator throughout the film. So you have these tropes. There is an attempt to add depth to them. We'll come back to that. The second kind of attempt at the teen comedy is the quippy dialogue or specific esoteric dialogue that kind of comes with the culture of trying to write teenagers. Now, my favourite kind of attempts at this try to entirely sidestep real slang and just make up their own stuff. That is usually my that's usually my favourite. I think this film does that. I wrote some down. For example, dilem is said in place of dilemma. A regular one used throughout is a mo, which is I presume, a shortening of homosexual. There is feroce balls, which I think is a compliment. The phrase "soup's gaymosexual" is also said. So you see how like there is an attempt to show that the in-group knows all the slang and is able to like navigate multiple spaces, and it's the Gretchen Wieners effect where if you keep saying a word, hopefully it'll catch on. The difference, I guess, is that in Mean Girls, Gretchen is uncool for trying to make a slang term popular, whereas the teenagers here are very much in the opposite direction. They keep saying new stuff and we just have to cope with it and presume that we're out of touch. There's also a mandatory makeover transformation scene, which isn't specific to the teen comedy. It occurs in the quote-unquote chick flick often, where a character who is drab and they turn to fab through the power of buying things. Tana even calls it like a makeover montage situation. There's also a scene where they walk slow motion down a hall. A lot of the plot relies on Tana potentially being prom king as a gay man. There is a party that everyone in school attends, and Tana even makes a speech at prom a la Mean Girls again. So you see how like the film is placing itself within the realm of the genre film. It's kind of not willing enough to go into full-on parody. Like this is not another teen movie situation where it's kind of just piling tropes on top of each other. There is actually plot in between these tropes. It's not well paced, I'd say. I think there is an attempt to make commentary about the teen movie, and I think it's at its strongest when it's doing that. It kind of fails to meaningfully subvert these tropes because I don't know that it treats itself as seriously as it should, which is odd because in other moments it treats itself far too seriously, and I'll get to that. First, I want to talk about subversion as an act of transgression, because the more movies I watch, the less interesting I find it when something is subverting expectations. I don't necessarily think that on its own that is enough for me to be a deconstruction. So, and this film does that as a thing a lot. In fact, the film like halts itself several times to be like, oh, you thought this girl was like this? Well, actually, she's like this. And then it does that 3 more times. I think that's what I mean when I say that this film is paced kind of horribly. Darren Stein also directed Jawbreaker, and my problem with that movie is that it really, really, really wants to be a dark comedy where women are horrible to each other and everyone is an arsehole because it is a rip-off of Heathers, and Darren Stein would admit that himself, so I'm not being insulting there. However, what it also wants to do is have these meaningful emotional moments, because if you make a movie where there is no emotional core and there's no main character, which I don't believe there is in Jawbreaker, then you just have a bunch of terrible people doing terrible things, and there is no entry point for anything else. The problem is that when you do that, when you add these like sappy moments into this, what is meant to be a satire of hierarchy and female friendships, when you inject that into the movie, it messes with the tone and it breaks immersion, and it stops you from doing what the film is intending for you to do, which is to turn these characters into analogies rather than people. And I think that is kind of what's happening here too. It can't decide if it wants to be this like biting, crass inversion of the teen comedy where tropes are broken down and heterosexuality has a stern talking to, and we come away from it kind of thinking that humanity is horrible and that nothing is good and that gay identity is at risk of becoming a commercialized thing rather than an experience people have and a intensely politicized experience, and also an articulation of the way people relate to one another. Unfortunately, it has to stop and be like, actually, have we considered that these girls might be different than what we expected and that they might have some depth to them, actually? And look, I love complex women. I don't feel like this film has its feet in either camp when it comes to this kind of dichotomy, right? It wants to be this kind of flat satire where everything is just like a metaphor, but it also wants to be this deep subversion where you're empathizing with a character that has, for the most part, been quite homophobic. And you're doing this by sacrificing what could have been time spent growing the friendship between the actually two gay characters. The subversions that I'm talking about, because I haven't even got to that bit yet. So Shlee is this very Christian girl. She's very Mormon. She has a Mormon boyfriend and she believes in God, but also she really wants the clout of a gay best friend, because a gay best friend would provide her with sex advice so that she could sidestep her Mormon identity and have sex like, teenagers do. If I'm being honest, I kind of like Shlee's plan the most. I think it's the most kind of transgressive of the three girls. But like I said, this film has too much going on and it's juggling all these things and it's not doing it well. So a lot of stuff just ends up getting dropped or not carefully considered. The implications of this teenage girl who's clearly very repressed and just wants someone to talk about sex to is having to drag a random gay kid into her life because who else would be able to understand this kind of transgression? That's an interesting plot. Unfortunately, Shlee is not that important to the plot, and that's going to come back again and again. Fawcett is like the stereotypical blonde mean girl, but wait 1 second, because she is secretly smart. And actually she knows that gay men don't have a heightened sense of fashion. You see? She's actually damaged because her boyfriend cheated on her. And she very much articulates this idea of why straight women and gay men tend to gravitate towards each other, at least from a straight woman's perspective, is that being friends with a gay man means that there's this kind of in-between of gender where there is no sexual relationship between these two people, but also it's not this kind of combative, internalized misogyny kind of relationship where women hate you because of the status that you have. It is kind of astonishing how much emotional labor Tanner ends up having to do for Fawcett, but I do think that it also does and could have hinted at a more interesting relationship between these two people, where Tanner actually has to confront why he is so happy being kind of ungendered by Fawcett for the sake of her being seen as a person, and what that kind of has to say about gender dynamics and misogyny and I suppose the relationships between cliques and teenage girls, right? Once again, this can't really be explored because this film has too much going on. Now, Caprice is the part of the story that I'm kind of frustrated it didn't become more interesting, because it definitely could have been. Caprice is the only one that is genuinely interested in gayness as a sexuality, as in Tanner wanting to be in relationships with men. The other two very much see him as an extension of themselves, where I think Caprice offers this kind of individualizing through going on a date, having another teenage boy go with you to the prom, right? And she very literally articulates this solidarity amongst minority groups, because Caprice is black and Tanner is gay. And her plan is to very much transgress the power structures of the prom king and queen as as we know them to be in the teen comedy film by injecting it with diversity. Again, an interesting plot that doesn't really go anywhere. And I think it really does hit on, and I feel like I've said it like 4 different times, that this film needed to be streamlined quite a bit, because what school has like 3 separate popular girls? It's an attempt to, I guess, satirize the idea of popularity, showing it as something very artificial, because if there is 1 popular girl at the top, why not 3? And why not, they're all doing all this stuff? And I get it, I understand what it's doing, but as I've said, it cannot focus its attention, and it's not hitting on the stuff that it presents well. I do think just paring it down a lot, focusing on one of these girls rather than pulling Tanner between these 3 girls and not really giving the relationships between them the air to breathe. If you want to do like a good subversion, you dig deep. You don't do like a surface thing. Not another teen movie gets away with this kind of stuff because it's like a mile a minute with the jokes. It's like da 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 da. It's a proper like spoof movie. It's not really interested in a particular story. It is interested in making references to stuff that you already know. Here, there is an attempt to make a story, and because it can't really decide what the story is until I'd say like a good 45 minutes into the movie, it ends up not really exploring the stuff that it sets up in the first place. And that is a problem because to a certain extent it ends up flattening out any kind of meaningful interrogation of the gay best friend trope.
I've noticed some disturbing trends in this school as of late. Seems that many of you girls are treating Tanner as more of a prize to be won than an actual person.
Miss Holgel, that's ridiculous. Right, T?
Listen, girls, I get the appeal. Well, I myself had a gay best friend once, and we were roommates for many fruitful years. But now, he's no longer with us.
Oh.
Oh, damn. What? Where'd he go?
He died of the HIV, dumbass.
Oh, God, no. He moved to San Diego with a leather queen.
GBF is pretty objectively, if you were to look at it as what it's meant to be, about the relationship between straight women and gay men. And it's a pretty complicated history, if we're being honest, because in the one sense, there has kind of been this assumed solidarity in a relatively transgressive way, because I think it's been an assumed truth that men and women cannot ever interact if they're not in a romantic or sexual situation, that platonic relationships between men and women can't really exist. So in a lot of ways, the straight woman and the gay man are a very transgressive thing, and that has been reflected in fiction. Margaret Cho wrote this very interesting piece on how she kind of very much embraced her relationship as a fag hag. I'll get onto that more in a bit, but just for what the piece is, it's basically her singing the praises of being a woman who is very happy in this platonic relationship with her gay male friends. So she specifically wrote in this piece, "Women and gay men have long been considered second-class citizens by the dominant culture. How do we keep our strength? By talking shit about those who think they can oppress us." Furthermore, in fiction specifically, the gay best friend originated as a progressive trope. As in, if the choice between gay men as villains, as people with secrets who are out to do various crimes, and gay men as like a naturalized part of the world, and in fact able to be friendly and kind and cooperative with heterosexuality, then the second one despite its various flaws, is preferable, in a lot of ways was praised for being so. However, there are obvious limitations to this in that in both of these tropes, the gay male identity can only be seen in relation to heterosexuality. The gay man goes back in the box once the straight woman has finished with him. This is obviously like a very cynical way to discuss what can be often very loving, legitimate relationships that aren't based on the commodification of identity. However, when you're talking about tropes and the way that often gay filmmakers, gay artists have not necessarily had control over mainstream representation, the straight lens is kind of, it becomes more oppressive the more gay artists want to make their voices known and find that the only language they have to use is that of previously established tropes. And on like a surface level, that is what this film is. It's pointing at this trope and being like, it's a bit weird that this is like a thing and it's been a thing for a long time, and that gay people are often not treated as humans but as kind of secondary to the heterosexual way of life, as if there is one that is like dominant and correct and other that is like secondary and a trend to be jumped on. Now, I promised I'd come back to the fag hag because whilst honestly the only character in this film that could kind of be called a fag hag would be Sophie, if we're being honest, even though I'm almost positive she is also gay. It is kind of important because there is this kind of storied legacy of straight women being in gay spaces and what that's kind of meant, and especially the term fag hag, which it doesn't feel like a complimentary term. And you know, the research that I've come across does very much indicate that it is more derogatory than complimentary, even if people very much embraced it. From what I read, it originated around the 60s and 70s, but it was definitely still popular in the 2000s because I remember hearing it. So the fag hag is a straight woman who hangs around gay men. That is the term, and depending on who is calling this woman the term, it can be seen affectionately, can also be like incredibly derogatory. I found two really good articles that I'll link below. The first is by Shannon Ludder's manual, How the Fag Hag Went from Hated to Celebrated. First coined pejoratively in the 1970s, the fag hag was a term used to describe feminist women who wished to align themselves with gay men in their fight for equality. The Stonewall riots, in which gay and LGBT regulars of the Stonewall Inn pushed back against a police raid, instigated the first major push for gay political organisation. Many in the gay community consider their fight for equality as separate from a gendered fight, and thus coined a term to distance themselves from their feminist peers. There's also the second article by Maria F. Fackler and Nick Salvato titled Fag Hag, A Theory of Effeminate Enthusiasms, and they say the ugly rhyme conjured up the stereotype of an often overweight, sexually dysfunctional woman who chose to surround herself with grudgingly welcome gay men and was thus deemed a tragic interloper. From these kind of definitions, it is kind of well established that straight women as like clinging on to the gay movement does have a tinge of misogyny, which is not to say like their concerns about kind of queer spaces being invaded, is that the right word, by heterosexuality aren't real, but that there is this assumption that if a woman has exclusively gay male friends, then it is because it's not a choice of hers, it's because she is sexually unavailable for some reason, potentially socially inept in that she can't understand that she's like a hanger-on or invading someone else's space where she's not wanted. It's this kind of assumption that this friendship isn't mutual and that either the gay man is being exploited or the straight woman is delusional. And I think that the film does kind of play with this idea. The onus isn't necessarily on any of the girls in the film, I think, and it's not on Brent or Tanner either. I think the onus kind of comes with this social pressure to be seen as culturally relevant. It very much values a kind of hierarchy of minority groups. It doesn't exist to dismantle them so much as present what different groups bring to each other. Once they cross paths and once they like find solidarity with each other, there are certain benefits, especially for those in a teen movie, to have the male perspective with none of the pressure of sexual availability. And it presents friendships between straight women and gay men as very transactional. I think, I established in the first section, this is not an optimistic film. It is very deeply cynical and treats identities very much as commodified, not necessarily commodifying them itself, but as things that people use to kind of get what they want and exploit other people. It's the kind of zeitgeisty writing that I think would only become more popular as people became more aware of identity politics and became more angry that teenagers are like trotting out buzzwords because they now know more about the world because of the internet, and people in their 30s writing TV shows and films will like overwhelm you with various kinds of identity politics based dialogue with the intent of being like, isn't it silly that the younger generation is so self-centered and obsessed with the very granular details of their identity, very much not interacting with the fact that a lot of the world is more on display now with the internet, and teenagers just having access to the various hierarchies of the world and being more aware of the ways that people are oppressed for their various identities, which is not to say that people don't exploit this language for their own personal gain. It does on occasion come across as very conservative when you hear dialogue of people, for example, saying their pronouns or listing out the various romantic and sexual attractions they have and saying their political leanings out loud. I'm looking at you, Tar, with the intent of being like, isn't it horrible that this is the way the younger generation talks now? Isn't it awful that they're obsessed with themselves? And then as we go down and down and down, you're like, isn't it awful that everyone is trans now, that everyone is gay now? And they rarely say that part out loud, but it is the kind of intent of their work. That's what we call a dog whistle, folks. When you have like a character like Soledad, who is mostly eager to have a gay student out because she wants a reason to have a GSA in the first place, because you can't have a gay-straight alliance if you don't have any out gay students, which to the very limited research that I did is not the case. I think the point of a GSA in the first place is that there isn't any pressure to come out, is that you work to advocate for gay and trans students with the intent that there isn't this pressure to be out. I do think that this film points to, I think, a lot of young people's desires to feel special about the world, and the leveraging of the various kinds of privilege that people have to get what they want is kind of what the film is about. So Caprice, Fawcett and Schley all leverage their popularity to stop Tanner from being hate crimed at school, and in return Tanner is kind of their little pet and he runs around solving their various problems, and it kind of wears him down a lot. He ends up getting into politics that he really had no interest in getting into, and the film's conclusion very much comes to, I just want to be a person. Can you let me be a person? At the same time, it's not a film that goes fully the other way, and I think that's what I was talking about in the first section, is that Darren Stein kind of refuses to let his films be mean, even though that's clearly what he's aiming for. And it becomes more frustrating, even though I understand it and to a certain extent respect it, even if it kind of neuters the satire that he's going for. In an interview for Slant magazine, he said, "I think for a gay kid, you need girls around to sort of validate you and give you power, so you're not invisible and not the other." I didn't have that, and I think that's why Jawbreaker was born, and why I ended up directing GBF. It's fun to create the high school that you fantasized about. It's this weird in-between where it can't make up its mind whether it wants to go full misogyny, make these women the enemy, or if it wants to praise these friendships, and it doesn't want to sacrifice this plot of sticking true to who you are. So it's trying to do all this stuff and it can't quite find the balance of it, even though as I'm going along I'm like, I agree with that. I wish there was some consistency. In the end, it's not like this friendship does nothing or is entirely degrading for Tanner, because like I said, it goes out of its way to portray these three girls as having dashes of humanity amongst their various catfights and egos. And in the end, they all, to a certain extent, end up getting quite political, getting quite invested in identity politics in a way that I don't believe they initially intended to. They were quite happy for Tanner to remain like a trendy object to pass around amongst them. But Fawcett in particular, she ends up becoming quite political. She even joins the GSA, even though she hates it, and offers to host and fund an alternate prom after Tanner is denied prom tickets for him and his male date. There is like gains to be made, even if Fawcett is doing it to one-up other people, which the film very much implies that she is. It's not as if there is nothing to be gained. And I think it's this balancing act of who is selfish and who is selfless. And I think the film ultimately comes to the conclusion that a lot of selfish acts can end up having selfless consequences. They can end up helping people more than hindering them. What this film attempts is to take this trope and display it as something that is very vapid and also quite complex. And I think that's where it goes wrong. What you'll find with a lot of these tropes is that when people try to deconstruct them, they usually go for comedy because it's the easiest mode to poke fun at something. They will tend to go for an inversion. See the SNL sketch Straight Male Friend, which I found on my adventures.
Straight Male Friend is a low-effort, low-stakes relationship that requires no emotional commitment, no financial investment, and other than the occasional video game-related outburst...
Ah, man, this game's stupid!
No drama.
Yo, you wanna go get wings?
If I didn't check in with my gal pals every day or two, it would turn into a whole thing. That's never an issue with Straight Male Friend. Hang out with him as little or as much as you want. It won't affect the friendship at all. Watch this. Hey, I might be moving to Europe for 7 years.
Go. Tell me when you're back.
It's this nagging feeling, I guess, that it's not quite enough, you know? This film was very clearly trying to be something. It's very clearly trying to be an iconic teen comedy, biting satire that takes this harmful trope and exposes it for the objectifying quality that it is. And I think when it is able to do that, it never quite does it far enough. And I think what I don't want is a film that doesn't trust its own premise and doesn't go fully into it like it should. Similarly, I don't think this film is able to juggle the nuances of the commodification of identity, of the prescribed sexlessness of the gay best friend, and also the potential misogyny that comes with being overly critical of the friendships between gay men and straight women all at once. Even though it is really, really trying to do that, I don't feel like it ever quite gets to the iconic heights that it seems to want to be.
WTFT. I secure you a date with the hottest teen homo in the tri-state area and that jizzbin still gets your endorsement?
What? But I didn't ever... What? Tanner Daniels endorsed Fawcett Brooks yesterday at the GSA meeting. The new power BFFs known as...
T-Foss. Cute, isn't it?
You really think another bland blonde like her deserves the crown, Tanner?
Well, at least she stands up for my rights or whatever.
What, please? This hacktivist doesn't give a flying fairy about gay rights. She just did it to gain the advantage with you.
Oh, you mean like what you do with that male-bait Christian?
Whatever. At least I tried to bribe him with sex. I treated him like an actual human being and not some asexual, neutered little purse puppy.
Come on, Tan. I've had enough bad dinner theater dramatics for one day. We've got a revolution to plan.
Do not come for my craft, bitch!
Do not come for my bitch.
What I want to talk about in this last section is the representations of sanctuary or safe spaces in this film. Because I actually think it's quite interesting the proto-depiction of what would steadily become the incorporation of online spaces and the diminishing real-life spaces that gay people can congregate in. Now, I don't think this film goes quite far enough. Thankfully, it doesn't have too many of its own social medias. They don't really do that much anymore, I think, because it's just easier to get the real stuff in there. There has been just a very long period of time where representing gay teenagehood meant representing secrecy and small, close-knit friendship and sexual relationships that were ineffable and intangible. And I think, whilst I wouldn't say it originated anything, it does kind of encapsulate how all those elements come together. What we have in this film is an app called Gaydar, and it is very clearly a spoof of Grindr without the added copyright issues, referenced as a slutty hookup app where you can post your headless torso and get various messages from other gay people to date and have sex with. Brent suggests that Tanner uses this app, and this is what ends up outing him because Soledad, the head of the GSA, uses the location function on this app to stalk and out Tanner to the whole school. So I thought it was really interesting to represent teenagers using Grindr because I think most people understand it to be the app where you can have gay sex and it's no strings attached. Not to diminish the sex part of Grindr. In my research for this episode, I did find at least 2 articles that kind of argued that many teenagers were using it not to have sex, but to find other gay teenagers. It could just be the case where gay teenagers are like, I'm not going to tell you about potentially illegal stuff that I'm doing, which, fair, good for you, don't snitch on yourself. But also, when your options for community are the gay bar, which you probably can't get into, or the gay sex app, which, yes, you do have to be 18 to use, but you can lie more easily to get onto it, then finding literally anyone who's like you, your options are quite limited. Moises Mendez II, in the article The Teens Slipping Through the Cracks on Dating Apps, said, many young people start accounts hoping to find other people around their age. Queer teens in particular sometimes come searching for a sense of community they can't find at home. Beatrice Hazelhurst, in the article Teens Are Certainly Using Grindr, Just Not for Sex, found that a 2018 study determined that 50% of sexually active teen boys aged 14 to 17 aren't using hookup apps for typical hookups. Instead, they're opening applications like Grindr to find friends. Dr. Catherine Macapagel told the Chicago Tribune that instead of sex, teens are hoping to connect with potential mates on a deeper level, particularly when they are still in the closet. As I said, are these teenagers going to be admitting to doing stuff that is potentially illegal? Probably not, especially if you are a closeted person. Still, I think it is interesting that often we use online spaces because real life spaces just aren't available to us. And when they are, they're kind of, for want of a better word, cringe. So the GSA, the Gay Straight Alliance in this school, is not presented as a cool group. When Tanner is explaining the various popular girls, he does not include Soledad or anyone in the GSA, because whilst having a gay best friend is cool, being politically active is not. And I think it is kind of interesting to reduce the GSA to that kind of idea. I think in a lot of people's minds, the idea of like very enthusiastic straight people and begrudging gay people who kind of put up with straight people in their spaces is quite a funny concept. And whilst I wasn't able to find a ton on like the persistence of GSAs, I was able to find that a lot of them popped up in the mid to late 2000s, specifically because of the amount of homophobic bullying, especially in the wake of gay teen suicide becoming like a really pressing issue. A lot of teenagers took it upon themselves to form these groups so that, one, the schools would listen to them regarding the state of homophobic bullying, and two, that it's something that they themselves have control over and are able to facilitate small change on a local level. A GSA, regardless of how cringe you might think it is, exists to provide any kind of space to interact with other gay people, even if you don't have the language to talk about your own identity yet. I think we do take it for granted sometimes how much language we have to now talk about various identities. I found this really interesting article written by Diana Tourget called "The Gay Straight Alliance Helped Me as Much as It Could." And I just wanted to shed some light from someone who was actually in one. The GSA was a valuable lifeline at a time in my life when I felt alienated and lost. We talked about some difficult things we were going through, and we talked about other things that made us happy. We learned about LGBTQ movies and books, slowly mapping out the American LGBTQ community's piecemeal history of beauty, survival, oppression, resistance, and death. Where this film kind of shifts, I'd say, is when it gets overtly political. In the first half of the movie, the GSA is very much presented as a selfish endeavour that Soledad is constructing because she wants to be popular. She wants people to know her and have respect for her. She wants to be seen as political, and she is willing to drag people out of the closet to do that. As the film goes on, it's quite clear that the political part of being a gay teenager is not something that can be relegated to this group or this character, that it becomes, to a certain extent, a whole school endeavour when the traditional prom ends up getting cancelled and everyone ends up going to the alternative prom, because that's the only prom that allows queer teens to go with their actual dates. What ends up happening though when this happens is the film has this, I don't want to say it feels objectively like a PSA, but there are moments where it is somewhat taking on the responsibilities of a PSA, where it feels it has to get more political than it is maybe equipped to deal with. So when Tanner is not allowed to buy prom tickets because he will be taking another teenage boy with him, it drifts into what would be very hot button issues around this period of time, very much predating the film, of young people getting involved with political movements via the internet and staging quite big and gaudy protests in the name of gay rights. So the two main examples that came into my head were the No Hate campaign, where various celebrities like stuck tape over their mouths and were like, "No hate," because it was in response to the Proposition 8 passed in California that would amend the state constitution to ban same-sex marriage. And it was a big deal because a lot of celebrities were like, this is horrible, and they did this photographic campaign. It went viral on the internet, and they would like paint no hate on their cheeks in protest. The other campaign that I think I mentioned earlier, was the It Gets Better campaign, which also had internet virality behind it, where a series of videos from different celebrities, but also like gay activists, made videos about how being a gay adult is something to look forward to, and that teenagers shouldn't be killing themselves, because it was specifically in response to the rash of suicides that had claimed the lives of several LGBT youth. Whilst this film doesn't so much interact with internet virality, in a certain sense, it's a film that's kind of scared of the internet, though I think if this film was made now, it would be more incorporated into it. But it is very much interacting with the idea that for a lot of young people, the political is very, very close to you, and you have more of a chance of getting involved with something because you have access to the internet, and you can do stuff like a publicity stunt to get attention for an issue that you care about. I don't want to reduce these campaigns too much down to being publicity stunts. That virality was very much a part of how people knew about them. And I think, whilst it is on a much smaller scale, I think deliberately staging an alternate prom in protest to the traditional prom is interacting with the ways that I think young people are seen to have a lot more success with activism, because it's something that can be done in one big burst and then doesn't need to be interacted with again. Like, we solved the issue and now the film's ended. Okay, so I talked about Grindr and I talked about the GSA, but for me, the most important part of this film is also the part that is kind of neglected the most. It's the friendship between Brent and Tanner. Now, it's not to say that this film doesn't pose some interesting questions about what it means to be out and what it means to be closeted and what it means to try something on with one of your friends and have it not really work, and how it ends up kind of not being that big of a deal, and how you can kind of end up still being friends afterwards. But okay, so a lot of the conflict in this film originates because Brent is somewhat responsible for Tanner being outed, and in response to this, Tanner outs Brent to his mother. Now, there aren't any consequences for this, but the film very much acknowledges that this is a dick move, and this conflict is kind of furthered when Tanner very literally puts Brent in the closet, which is a moment I did definitely laugh out loud to. It's this idea where you have this sanctuary with the only other gay person that you know, but as a result, a lot ends up, you end up putting a lot on each other. It's one of the few films where I feel like that is represented here, where because you don't really have anyone else, everything to do with queerness, it ends up coming back to them, and how you relate to that and how they relate to that, and how these don't always come together, and how that in and of itself causes a lot of conflict. Some of my favourite moments are just moments where these two teenagers are able to be teenagers. It's a film that is most successful when it represents the strain that having to be a political figure puts on this relationship. Brent ends up becoming very, like, performatively homophobic in response to Tanner choosing to hide him from his parents. It's this idea that the friendships that gay people have with one another as teenagers, they can at times end up being incredibly codependent and incredibly emotional, and based on the idea that if this person stopped being my friend, then I've also lost this lifeline and this connection to this identity that for the most part I don't really understand. And for me, I think the choice to have these two characters kiss, potentially sleep together, though it's kind of ambiguous whether they do, and also at the end choose friendship because they assume that this will be more long lasting for them, is really interesting. I also think from personal experience it's kind of accurate how these relationships tend to flourish more as friendships if you grow around each other and you learn to be less codependent and you learn to like each other outside of the fact that you're both of a similar sexuality, and that is not necessary for you to date and have sex with each other if you don't want to do that. And I think it's really nice that at the end of the film they both still have each other, even if we had to go through all of this unnecessary mess to get here. That is the connection between these two teenage boys that remains. I think that's nice. Let's ask the question, does it look like a badger? A little bit. I think less than people assume, but it's definitely not a film that's going to stand the test of time. As with other Stein movies, there are pacing and tone issues where the films feel like they're trying to do too much. It wants to be a dark satire like Heathers, but also wants to have soapy PSA-like moments where we see the facile humanity of these thinly drawn characters, and it mostly doesn't work. Brent's storyline isn't given enough time or depth to be interesting. This film really needed to be about their friendship, and instead they spend most of the movie not interacting with one another. It is dated, like it was kind of dated the second it came out, but that is to be expected in my opinion. Most teen comedies don't age well. If you go back and watch some of them, you might not like them anymore. I'm going to send you away with some recommendations. One of them is a movie that I already talked about earlier, and it's called Edge of 17, and it's about this teenage boy who, after getting a summer job, meets his crush, who is a college student who works at the same place that he does, and he ends up going through some trials and some tribulations. Like I said earlier, it's not a romantic comedy like people describe it as. It's more of a teenage drama, coming of age story. It's about first romances and having a strained relationship with your mother, which we can all relate to. This next recommendation is potentially too obvious, but I think it's one of the modern teen films that I've actually liked. And I think because it's just written by a lot of funny people. It's Booksmart. I'm gonna fight for this one. It's a really good, fun time, and it doesn't put too much pressure on its gay storyline, and it takes it seriously, but it also doesn't sacrifice the tone. I don't think it remains funny throughout, and it's just really great, and I still like it. And yeah, I refuse to cringe. I refuse. That's the end. You can leave. Thank you very much for listening. I will be back shortly with another bonus episode covering new releases, as well as my regularly scheduled deep dive in June. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter @LikeABadgerPod, if you can stand being on there, because I can't really. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. All of my sources are in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will speak to you next time. Bye bye!